What if Jesus never appeared to the disciples again? A dark biblical thought experiment. What if Jesus resurrected but never appeared again to the disciples? The empty tomb brought no answers, only fear and silence. No proof, no final word, no confirming gaze. Only absence. In this story, faith is born without witnesses, hope without certainty, and the world changes forever when the resurrected one chooses not to return. Without appearances, the disciples are left alone with an empty tomb and accusations of lying. The world doesn't believe, the powerful react, and faith must decide whether to survive without proof. But ancient accounts suggest that this absence was neither a mistake nor an accident. Something happened after the resurrection, a silent choice that changed the destiny of the message and placed upon mankind a burden they should never have borne. When this forgotten detail comes to light, you will understand why Jesus not returning may be more unsettling than never having risen. It all begins the morning after the tomb is found empty. The disciples gather in secret, waiting for what was promised to them. But nothing happens. No apparition, no voice, no sign. Fear dominates the atmosphere, mixed with confusion and guilt. They wonder if they were wrong, if they imagined it all, if hope died there. The absence of Jesus is heavier than the cross, because now there is no direction. The silence transforms the resurrection into doubt, and faith is born fragile, sustained only by the memory of past words that, without confirmation, begin to seem dangerously insufficient to face the world that observes them. As the days pass without any sign, doubt begins to gnaw at the group. Some believe that Jesus resurrected and simply departed. Others fear that it is all a terrible mistake. Without an apparition to unify their interpretations, awkward silences and suspicious glances arise. Each disciple carries their own interpretation, and unity slowly unravels. The empty tomb ceases to be a source of hope and becomes a threat, as it can be seen as theft, a lie, or heresy. In this vacuum, faith ceases to be a shared certainty and transforms into a personal risk, something that could cost a life if proclaimed aloud. When the authorities realize there were no apparitions, the narrative quickly changes. Without witnesses to the resurrected figure, the religious leaders gain the upper hand. They claim it was all a collective illusion, a final delusion of desperate followers. The Romans observe coldly, ready to crush any attempt at revolt based on rumors. The disciples feel the weight of this absence, for they cannot point to an encounter, only to emptiness. The resurrection, faceless and voiceless, becomes fragile in the face of power. In this scenario, believing becomes a solitary, dangerous act, sustained only by the inner conviction that silence does not signify defeat, but something still impossible to comprehend. As time goes on, fear begins to separate the disciples. Without Jesus to gather them, correct them, or encourage them, each one reacts differently to the silence. Some consider returning to their old lives, others insist on remaining together, even without clear direction. There are no final commissions, no visible promise of power or mission, only the memory that he spoke of a kingdom to come. The absence transforms waiting into weariness, and hope into a burden. At this point, continuing to believe ceases to be comfort and becomes a conscious choice, made in the dark, without any guarantee that it will not end in persecution, failure, or total oblivion. Some disciples begin to recount their experiences even without proof. They don't speak of encounters, only of an open tomb and remembered words. The people listen with distrust, for without apparitions there is no confirmation, only bare faith. Each account sounds fragile, easily contested. Yet something strange happens, for the message spreads not through certainty, but through courage. Those who hear are not convinced by signs, but touched by the idea of believing without seeing. The absence of Jesus forces faith to mature too early, making it clear that following that path would mean carrying doubts forever, never receiving the security that everyone expected. If this interpretation is making you rethink this story, leave a comment below with your perspective. These videos are meant to provoke reflection, and I read all the comments. And if this type of content interests you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Without appearances, the resurrection ceases to be a public event and becomes an inner conflict. Each disciple struggles to keep alive a conviction that no one can prove. Jesus' silence begins to be interpreted in different ways, as a test, abandonment, or an unfinished mission. Some begin to understand that perhaps he did not return precisely so as not to replace faith with evidence. This idea is frightening because it places all the responsibility on ordinary men. Without visible miracles, the message must walk alone. At this point, believing is no longer waiting for confirmation, but deciding to move forward even when everything seems to indicate that it would be safer to remain silent and forget. The persecution begins silently, almost administratively. Without appearances to inflame crowds, the authorities act with precision, isolating voices, denying rumors, stifling gatherings. The disciples realize there is no visible supernatural protection, no dramatic comeback to silence accusers. Each arrest, each threat, confirms that they are alone. Yet, something unexpected happens, for the absence of Jesus removes any hope of external rescue. Faith begins to exist without shortcuts, and moving forward means accepting real losses. In this scenario, conviction is strengthened not by what is seen, but by what is refused to be denied, even when the silence seems total. Over the years, the story of the empty tomb continues to circulate, but it never truly ends. Without apparitions, each community shapes the message from the absence. Some see it as a call to spiritual maturity, others see only an unsolvable mystery. Faith ceases to depend on a spectacular event and begins to rely on the silent transformation of those who believe. The impact is not in what Jesus did after the resurrection, but in what his followers become despite the silence. In this world, Christianity is not born from trial but from persistence, and the absence of the Master becomes the space where each person must decide who they are, what they believe in, and how far they are willing to go without guarantees. Over time, this faith without apparitions begins to shape a different spirituality. Without physical encounters with the resurrected one, the message loses its triumphant tone and gains the weight of responsibility. There is no immediate glory, only daily consistency. The absence of Jesus prevents the idolatry of the image and compels followers to live what they have heard, not what they have seen. Faith ceases to be a spectacle and becomes a silent practice, observed in gestures, choices, and resistance in the face of injustice. In this scenario, to believe means to take the risk of being wrong, but still act as if love, forgiveness, and truth were real, even without any visible confirmation. Decades later, as the first disciples begin to die, their absence weighs heavily once more. Without apparitions to recount, they leave only testimonies of transformed lives. They don't tell how they saw the resurrected Jesus, but how they lived as if he were present. This weakens some, but profoundly strengthens others. Faith no longer depends on eyewitness memory, but on ethical continuity. The original silence lingers over time, and the message survives not through supernatural accounts, but through communities that choose to love, forgive, and resist even when everything suggests it would be easier to abandon this faceless and voiceless hope. With the distance of centuries, Christianity in this world is studied as a strange phenomenon. Historians note that it was born without final proof, without a decisive account of the resurrected Christ, sustained only by human persistence. There is no clear founding moment, only an initial void that has never been filled. This absence prevents rigid dogmas and absolute certainties. Faith remains open, vulnerable, always at risk of disappearing. Paradoxically, this is what keeps it alive. Without the final appearance, the message does not close into a system. It continues to provoke questions, demanding choices, forcing each generation to decide whether it is worthwhile to believe, even when God seems to have chosen silence as the final answer. At some point, the inevitable question arises among those who still believe. What if Jesus didn't appear precisely so that faith wouldn't be reduced to historical evidence? In this world, it's understood that absence wasn't failure, but displacement. The presence that was once physical becomes ethical, lived in the other. Without appearances, no one can outsource spiritual responsibility. There's no one left to point and say, "He's returned." All that remains is to live as if the kingdom has already begun, even without visible signs. This understanding matures slowly and exacts a high price because it transforms each follower into a living witness, without excuses, without guarantees, and without the comfortable security of a final proof. In the end, this alternate world reveals something uncomfortable about our own. By imagining a resurrected Jesus who never returned to his disciples, we realize how much we depend on confirmations to sustain our faith. Here, silence didn't destroy the message, it only made it more demanding. Without appearances, belief had to walk alone, supported only by the human decision to continue. And perhaps this is the most disturbing revelation of all, that the deepest faith is not born when God appears, but when he chooses not to appear, leaving humanity with the responsibility of living as if love, truth, and hope were still real, even when heaven remains closed and in absolute silence. If you enjoyed this approach and want to continue exploring stories that are almost never told this way, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And now, click on the video that's appearing on the screen. It directly complements what you just watched and may completely change the way you see this story.